You know, my MacBook Pro is quite good, but you know what? I really need something a little more expandable, a little more versatile, a little less engineered to be thrown away, something that can be worked on easily. It's just not doing it for me, man. So I'm just gonna, throw that thing in the trash bin, and we're gonna go ahead and grab a machine that actually meets all of those criteria. Welcome, PowerBook Pismo. Welcome to another Marcintosh 2022 video. In this one, we actually returned to a PowerBook that I did a video on about 3 years ago. Well, kind of. This is a combination of two PowerBook G3s, both with their own fun stories. The first one, and the one we're revisiting, is the DOS Dude 1 PowerBook G3, the original one I got in 2019. So it goes, DOS Dude 1 got a handful of Pismos, and I asked if he'd not mind selling one to me, and he just offered to send one to me for free. And I'm eternally grateful for that, even to this very day. Unfortunately, it was not in the best shape. The screen had a line of dead or stuck pixels, I'm not sure which is more appropriate to say here, and someone replaced the optical drive with one that looked like it was from an iBook G4, grafted into the drive assembly, which looked kind of odd and did not look right at all on this machine, and the bezel was completely gone, so the internals of the drive were just out for the elements, and I did not like that at all. On top of that, the plastics at the back were starting to crack, so I had to weld those back together, and it didn't look very good, but it was functional. While I was making repairs on that machine, I accidentally broke one of the keys off the keyboard. Like, I broke it. The key switch was still good and the scissor switch was still good, but the key itself had some broken plastic, so I wasn't able to just stick it back on. However, after the repairs were complete and I used this machine for a bit, I eventually handed it off to another friend of mine, Noah. And he needs no introduction for the longtime viewers of the channel, but for the newer among you, he is one of my kind of IRL friends in Texas. I've met him a few times. He's actually come to my house once, took a few machines off my hands. We brokered a trade, and I sent the machine to him in exchange for another PowerBook and some gaming stuff. And he's had it for the last year or two. I can't remember because time is a construct. Oh, God. But since I've been getting more into vintage things as of late, I asked him if he still had it, and he did. So we brokered another trade, or another deal, because there wasn't really anything traded on my end, to get the machine back. And I got it back, and here it is, kind of. Because this is an amalgamation of two different PowerBooks, as we'll go into later. The second Pismo was actually attained a few weeks ago, well, it feels like a few weeks ago at least. Brian and I went to a e-waste place, and he was actually on a mission to get a Pismo of his own, because he really wanted one. For some reason, I cannot remember why. I think DOS Dude 1 was actually talking him up into getting one, and that's kind of how things went. I'm not sure. We found one and bought it, but alas, it was missing some critical components and the trackpad didn't want to work. Since it was in need of so much work and he was able to actually get a better conditioned Pismo, at least get a source on one, whether he's going to get it is up to time at this point, he decided to just hand this one off to me, and I opted to just grab the good components off of it and put them on my original Pismo, and that's how we have two Pismos combined into one here. Storytime aside, let's go ahead and look at the machine itself. From the front here, we have the latch release. And look, it actually has some spring to it. Most older Macs I get lose this little bit of spring tension, and generally you have to manually open them with some difficulty, like getting your fingernails in here to open the machine up. But thankfully, not this one, and we can demonstrate again, laying flat, having gravity work against it, it still springs open perfectly fine. On this side, we have the battery bay with the original battery. Again, gravity working against us here, but there's the original battery. We have the CPU cooling vent with a little itty-bitty fan right behind there, and the card bus slot, which seems to have suffered a small injustice that I can probably fix at a later time, but not right now. And you can't see it, but the airport card is actually right above this little slot here, which this is why the Pismo, and I believe the Lombard, I can't remember if the Lombard did this too, dropped to one slot, because they decided to dedicate the top slot to the airport card, which is internal to the machine now. Back here we have the port door, which is still intact, and this is ultimately why I decided when I was making one good PowerBook, I stuck with the slightly cosmetically worse bottom panel of the DOS Dude 1 PowerBook, because this port door is in perfect shape, aligned perfectly with the back, whereas the port door on the e-waste PowerBook was a little misaligned and I didn't want to fuss with it for fear of breaking it. Behind the door, well, before we go behind the door, we have the DC in jack and the infrared window. Behind the door, we have our audio in and out, 2 USB 1.1, an Ethernet port, 2 Firewire ports, S-video out with what looks like provisions for a breakout dongle of some sort, probably to do composite video. I could be wrong about that. VGA, modem, and we have the 2 sets of screws here that hold the display on the bottom frame. You also see the clutch covers trying to make a bit of a break for it, but I can fix that later. On the other side, we have Kensington lock, air intake for the hard drive too. This hard drive is right behind this little window here. And we have the optical drive, which is a DVD-ROM. And back when this machine was new, DVD-ROM drives were actually not all that common. In fact, I actually remember, sidebar here, I actually remember a lot of gamers getting quite tilted at games moving to DVD media back then, because not a lot of people had DVD drives. And I remember Computer Gaming World, I believe it was, published an article that I remember saying, hey, you know, it's time to get a DVD drive. Just stop lollygagging and do it, please. Sidebar aside here, let's get back to the machine itself. Let's go ahead and open this thing up and just have a look inside of it. And no, for you people out there who really want to see inside the machine, we're not going to be doing that because I don't feel like dealing with that at this current time. This is not the most perfect palm rest ever. This is actually the one from the DOS Dude 1 machine, but I opted to stick with the DOS Dude 1 machine's palm rest because I wasn't sure if something had gone critically wrong with the e-waste Pismo, because the e-waste Pismo had a broken trackpad and trackpad button. And that's what caused me ultimately to just use that machine for parts rather than transferring my stuff from this machine into that machine, because these two components here, even though they look very close to each other, they are worlds apart inside the machine. The trackpad connects directly to the logic board in the machine. This is actually on a little subboard that comes down here for the drive bays and battery bay. And given that the two components are completely separated on the logic board, but neither of them work, and I did make sure the button itself actually worked by probing it with a multimeter, I was a little worried that connecting the trackpad up to a known good board might just break it. So I didn't want to bring that over for fear that I would break something. And on top of that, the trackpad is actually welded to the palm rest. So I can't just replace the trackpad, unfortunately. So it is what it is. It works perfectly fine. Just got a little bit of wear in the middle there. This keyboard has a little bit of mileage on it, but for the most part, it's pretty good. It's in pretty good condition. Spacebar has a little bit of wear. The D key has a little bit of wear, I can see. But for the most part, I'm not seeing a lot of these buttons have any really bad wear on them. The lettering is still all there perfectly fine. And the Option key was the one that suffered the injustice of me going a bit too hard with a cleaning cloth. But as you can see, perfectly fine because I was able to grab a key from the other keyboard, which unfortunately, whoever worked on the e-waste Pismo just ripped that keyboard out with reckless abandon. And it got all bent out of shape and I didn't feel like trying to fix the bend for fear that I might break it, so I decided to just keep the better keyboard in this machine and replace the key with a better one. I might grab the D key off of that keyboard too if it's in better shape, and maybe the space bar. I don't know how far I want to go with it just yet. But as you might be able to tell from the clutch cover trying to make a break for it, I did bring that over from the e-waste Pismo as well, and also the display and lid, because the display, like I said, had a line of dead pixels, and this one is a bit worse for wear, but it doesn't have a line of dead pixels, so I'm a little more partial to it. This display is kind of dim and washed out, unfortunately, so not really much I can do about that. Also, cosmetically, while the top is in much better shape, we do have a pretty deep little gouge right here, but again, the soft touch bit is actually in really good condition, and there's no cracking in the plastic either, so overall, I think I made off pretty good with this display. So let's go ahead and turn this thing on. And before we start this, I'm going to call your attention to the fact that we're not actually plugged into anything at the moment. I do have the power adapter on standby, so just one moment while I kill the lights. Alright, now we're at the desktop for 10.1. Not sure how well it'll come across on camera, but we've got the more prominent pinstriping in the UI here, and the lovely Aqua UI in full display, which arguably is more in your face in these older versions, as they toned it way down in subsequent OS X releases. And as for the pinstripes, they ditched those entirely in 10.4. 10.3, they made them almost invisible. You had to really look for them. And in the Finder windows, they actually got rid of them entirely, if I recall correctly. Anyway, let's go ahead and poke at this machine's specs, since we never talked about those before. About this Mac is relatively primitive in this version of Mac OS X, which is 10.1.5, which, slight sidebar, that was an adventure and a half to get this thing updated, because this is back before you had combo updates that could effectively ignore all previous updates. You just install the combo update and you're done for the most part. This one had some prerequisites that I had to install beforehand, and they really did streamline the update process a lot over the years. So hey, yay for progress. But here we can see that because this machine spent even a millisecond in his possession, DOS-Dude1 has worked his magic and blessed this machine with his own handmade G4 upgrade. We can also see that this machine is maxed out with 1 GB of RAM, which I'd actually forgotten about. Pretty surprising. Again, it feels like I've not had this machine in my possession in 10 years, so I've kind of put this machine out of my mind for the most part until I got it back. But as we can see, like I said, very primitive, and we don't even have a link to Apple System Profiler. So what we actually have to do is Command-Shift-A, which doesn't actually work in this Mac OS version, because Apple didn't introduce that till later. Okay, well, they actually did have it, but it's a completely different key combo. It is Command-Option-A, which to me is a little bit harder to hit with one hand. So I can see why they changed it to Command-Shift-A. It just feels more intuitive, but that could be just years of learning that particular shortcut. Not sure when they changed it, but I'm sure someone in the comments will chime in and tell me, hey, yeah, they did that in 10.3. So a very quick sidebar here. We can kind of see this is before Safari, so we had Internet Explorer as our browser of choice. iTunes with the old 3-note logo here. Actually shipped with Acrobat Reader instead of Preview. Well, I think we still have Preview. I don't know if it can open PDFs, but this is before Apple decided to just say Preview's your lot. That's what you're going to use for PDFs, and making it a really powerful PDF utility, which is kind of funny. Another sidebar that they just call it Preview still to this day, because it's quite a powerful utility if you know how to work it. So let's go to Utilities, and here we can find Apple System Profiler. And here we can see the deeper details of this particular machine. We have macOS 10.1.5. I have 1 GB of built-in memory. There are 2 slots, one on each side of the CPU card. 1 MB of backside L2 cache. Machine ID 406 with a 550 MHz PowerPC G4. So this originally began life as a 500 MHz PowerPC G3. So it's pretty nice to see this thing have a slight overclock, and it still runs. I'm pretty impressed. I would have expected this machine to get a little hot under the collar and eventually have some trouble, but no, it runs pretty well. Over on devices and volumes, we have 2 USB 1.1 ports, as we can see. FireWire with nothing connected. You have PCI, which this is really weird. I'm not sure if this is like a limitation of early Apple System Profiler, but we have PCI then AGP. Like the AGP card is listed on the PCI bus. Really odd, but what can you do? We have a Rage M3 in this machine using the AGP bus internally, which is quite nice, a bit of a step up over PCI at the time. And then we have the card bus slot right here. We also have the hard drive, which is an 80 gig Hitachi, which is quite nice, because I've never really had an issue with Hitachi drives. They've always been very good to me over the years. I actually have a 12-year-old Hitachi drive in my custom built that I've had since it was brand new, and it's still running to this very day. So I'm very happy about that, and Hitachi drives are generally pretty good. Sidebar aside there, we have the DVD-ROM drive, which does actually work. I've tried it. I actually used it to install macOS. So very, very nice to have that here. Go ahead and close that out. We can look at our utilities folder, and we can see, some fun things. This is back before Apple had the archive utility, so they still use Stuff at Expander. We also have Grab, which is the screenshot utility. We still have Disk Copy, which is interesting, before Apple just completely made that internal and non-user facing. We have the Applet Launcher, which I believe is for Java. The CPU Monitor, which just gives you a CPU usage graph somewhere here. I guess I have to bring the floating window up. There it is right there. There's our CPU usage. Not sure when Apple got rid of that. I think it was in 10.3. I could be wrong. I really need to reinstall 10.2 and get back to grips with that, because I stopped using 10.2 way back. Like in the mid-2000s, I had an iMac G3, and now I'm going off on a tangent here. I do apologize. But I had an iMac G3, and my friend put 10.2 on it. Eventually, we put 10.4 on it. and that was what I was using until I eventually got a PowerMac G4. Then I used the PowerMac G4 for a while, then that's when I got my late 06 MacBook Pro. So I used 10.4 for a good long while, and it was a fun time. Man, I miss those days, kind of. So one thing I want to look at is a utility that we kind of take for granted these days, and that is disk utility. This is kind of when it was in a bit of a metamorphosis. It's clearly maturing from where it started in OS 9 at least, becoming the amalgamation. Well, in OS 9 it started as drive setup and disk first aid kind of split apart. But in 10.0, I can't remember if it was 10.0 or if it was here in 10.1, it became the amalgamation of disk first aid and drive setup mashed into one utility called disk utility. And this was when it was kind of starting to grow its sea legs, so to speak. And I believe it was more finalized in either 10.2 or 10.3. And it became the disk utility we would know and love for many, many years until El Capitan, which was OS 10.11, just uprooted the whole thing and threw it all out. And we got the disk utility we have now, which is absolute dog crap. So let's go ahead and give a quick whirlwind tour of the disk utility. We can select my disk. There's our capacity, the model number, connection bus, connection type, blah, 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 blah. We can first aid the disk, and it cannot do anything here. This is before it could do anything to the disk while it was started up off the disk. Newer macOS versions can lock the disk and verify, and you'd have to reboot to actually do any repairs. And I believe new versions of macOS can do all this live. So this was clearly an evolution or a thing that evolved over time. We can erase the disk, which looks relatively standard. Partition, which this is like the advanced panel of drive setup, just kind of meshed in here. And then we have RAID, which we're not going to really mess with. Unfortunately, I haven't really done too much with this install just yet. This is relatively fresh. Before we call this episode done, though, we could just kind of bask in what early OS 10 was like. I really like the little iMac up here, the home icon in the Finder navigation bar. It just felt like it had more soul in it than newer macOS versions do. And again, the Aqua UI, as Steve Jobs said, you just want to lick it. Looks so nice. I kind of miss these old days of when it felt like software had more personality to it. And like I said, I'm not sure if the camera can pick it up, but we have the pinstriping. It's very prevalent here as I try to zoom you guys in to see it. It just all looks very, very early 2000s. I don't know, it just makes me really miss those good old days. And especially since I still use Macs to this day. I have a newer MacBook, as you saw in the intro. It's kind of fun to just look back at this and remember what early Mac OS 10 started out as and what it looked like and comparing it to now, long after Aqua has been retired for a more flat, uniform, and admittedly kind of soulless look to it. I do look forward to digging into this machine a little bit more after I've got more time, because with Marcintosh 2022, sadly things around here are moving at a breakneck pace, and I don't really have the time to sit back and enjoy the machine for what it is. But eventually this machine will have its time in the limelight yet again. So that's all for this video. If you enjoyed it, please don't forget to drop a like. It really does help out a lot. And maybe consider subscribing if you like these shenanigans. Until next time, bye for now.